Good afternoon to most of you where you are. Good evening, perhaps to some. Welcome to the fourth session of the Root Causes series of migration from Central America, with voices from leaders and allies from the sub-region. Today, we have a great conversation with journalists and advocates who are working on the ground. When Alianza Americas decided to convene this series, we thought that it was necessary, vital, to raise the voices from Central America in an effort to collectively build a deeper and nuanced understanding and analysis of the root causes driving migration from Central America in recent decades. We hope that this series contributes to highlight what needs to change to address forced displacement in the region. Today, we will discuss about violence, which is indeed a challenging, difficult, and painful topic. It's much easier to read and to learn from it from a distance, but it's definitely a very painful element of the daily life of individuals working and living in these countries. And so we are very thankful to our panelists, our guests today for this conversation. We're also very happy to share with you all that this series came about as a joint effort led by Alianza Americas with the joint sponsorship of the Latin American Working Group, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, OXFAM America, and Presente.org, Casa, Yurumein, ONECA, which is Organización Negra Centroamericana, Centro Presente, CARECEN San Francisco, Hondurans Against AIDS, and CARECEN Washington, D.C. We also want to acknowledge the support of Latino rebels who are sharing this event live on their Facebook page. If you missed this conversation or if you want to share this conversation with someone else, the conversations are available in Alianza's YouTube channel as well. So we decided today to convene this conversation with three very interesting and powerful women. We thank you for being here today with us. We have Danielle Mackey, who lives in Honduras. Danielle Mackey was an independent investigative journalist based in El Salvador for greater part of 12 years and a contributor to the Honduran publication Contracorriente. She now works on the editorial staff of The New Yorker, writing for various US publications, and is at work on long-term projects about Central America and US foreign policy in the region. Danielle, thank you for being here today with us. We are also bringing to the conversation our second guest, Alejandra Gutierrez Valdisan. Alejandra is a journalist, an editor, and co-founder, editor-in-chief, and CEO of Agencia Ocote, a digital outlet based in Guatemala. Alejandra, this may be your chance to share with us all in the chat Agencia Ocote's link so that all of you can check it. Alejandra has focused her career on in-depth investigative and narrative journalism, specializing in human rights, women, environment, memory, security, and violence. Alejandra, welcome to our conversation today. And our third guest is Jeanne Rikkers. Jeanne is a human rights advocate and peace builder living and working in Central America since the 1990s. During the past 29 years of living in El Salvador, she has focused on research, education, and accompaniment of at-risk communities to stop the cycles of violence and advocate for public policy on security that will contribute to a culture of peace. Jeanne is currently the Director of Human Rights Research and Learning at Cristosal, an international human rights organization working in Northern Central America. Welcome to the three of you. It's fantastic to have you for the conversation today. So we are also want to invite those who are participating in the event directly today to use the option of the Q&A, which is on the lower bar at the end of their website, to ask questions. You can ask general questions, or if you want to ask any of our guests to go in depth into any of the issues, please do so. So let me start with the first question that we have for all of you. Northern Central America is labeled as one of the most dangerous territories worldwide. What specific elements make Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador the most violent countries of this region? I would like to start this first round giving Danielle the floor first to begin. Not an easy question, I know.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to be with these two just extraordinary women. It's such a pleasure. Also, I want to just clarify, unfortunately, I don't live in Honduras. I'm coming as somebody who used to work for a Honduran publication and continues to collaborate with the amazing folks at Contracorriente as time permits. But my response would actually be, I think it's important to focus on economic violence. I think that, especially in speaking from Honduras, for the last decade at least, Honduras is consistently the most or the second most unequal country in the hemisphere and one of the most unequal in the world. Highly, highly concentrated wealth. More than 50% of the population lives in poverty. And community and local organizations have always been public and clear about this as a problem, how economic violence works, what its impact is on them, how it's expressed as other violences. You know, they consistently point out that money in Honduras buys cooperation from military and the police to do the bidding of private capital. We see evidence of that recently in what's coming out in the trials for the murder of Berta Cáceres, how the dam company, DESA, was intricately intertwined with military and police. We also see that in the evidence that's coming out of the Southern District of New York's series of drug trials that seem ultimately aimed at President Juan Orlando Hernandez, although that remains to be seen. Those trials have brought out plenty of information about how the police and the military work on behalf of the private sector and the political elite. And I think, you know, we've also seen plenty of evidence about how the political elite has essentially turned the state into a private funding source, poking holes in the state so that it becomes like a sieve and fills their private bank accounts, but also, you know, makes political campaigns more robust. Community organizations have been vocal and articulate about how the international development schemes that are most frequently forced upon them, especially in the neoliberal framework, destroy the environment, subvert their bedrock values, spiritualities, especially for Native peoples like the Garifunas or the Lencas, rip apart the fabric of their communities, all of which of course contributes to immigration. And I think the problem is that these analyses and these visions haven't been taken seriously by international authorities who tend to see development in terms of theory and, you know, making sure that Honduras enters the world market, the world financial system, plugging into markets. Those communities and their visions are written off as, you know, with a lot of implicit white supremacy and classism, rabble rousers, they're backwards, they're anti-modernity, they're just protesters with their antics. And so I think that it's important to point to the fact that this clarity has been out there for a while. Folks just haven't been listened to.
Thank you, Danielle. I think it's important to include economic violence. I think that that's a very valuable point. And sometimes we listen and we read about very restrictive definitions of violence. So thank you for bringing that point to the discussion. Alejandra, what elements do you think make this the most violent countries?
Oof. You have 24 hours. I would like to point before that it's like a lot of elements that we share between countries. So probably we could repeat like a lot of elements. So it's like, yeah, we share like a lot of roots of this violence. But I will go centuries ago and try to find that is historical explanation for the violence also. We are conquer territories, and it's been like Danielle already pointed, is like the the fight for the land, the oppression, the racial oppression. So these explanations comes from centuries ago. And decades ago, we have these wars, and we cannot forget that all countries, especially El Salvador and Guatemala, we are just yesterday that we signed our peace acuerdos, sorry. But it's like yesterday. We are not, we haven't trespass the conflict that we already had, and the process of justice are already happening with a lot of impunity also. So these things I think is so important because this explains a lot, I think. And also I will point the impunity for sure, because the big statistics of impunity in our countries also are like one of the biggest in the world, and is crossed with this. And also, like Danielle already said, for sure, inequality to access to the health, to education, to culture, is like for sure an explosion for this violence. And also I will point the sexism, for sure. El machismo that is also explained probably for the historical things, etc., is one of the or huge problems in the region. And I will let this by now.
Thank you, Alejandra. I think that it is indeed a very good point to make. You know, we always try to make some distinctions, and I think that you made up a couple of them which are important about understanding, you know, the impact of the conflicts in El Salvador and in Guatemala versus a different situation in Honduras. But and I think that your comment about, you know, the armed conflicts, the inability to deal with them, and impunity are a great segue to invite Jeanne into the conversation and to ask her what she would add in what we are kind of saying that are these intertwined, complex layers of elements. And also, I think your point about the historical context, it's central. What would you add, Jeanne, to this point?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I was going to say, you know, just patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, and white supremacy. I mean, that's the package that we're dealing with, and probably what we're dealing with around the world, right? So what makes El Salvador, what are some of the unique factors for El Salvador? I think definitely the long history of violence being used in the country by the state to control society is common in the other countries, but in this very small country with a large population that lived under that violence for a long time and used violence to try and gain rights and gain space. The civil war in El Salvador was very different than the civil war in Guatemala, in that there was a much larger percentage of the population that was directly in contact with the conflict over time, and involved or exposed. And that historical violence, as Alejandra said, I mean, it's just present in people. The trauma was never dealt with. There were never processes of looking at how the effects of that violence were going to influence social fabric over time, or people's participation in democracy was going to be conditioned by their ability to understand conflict as something that can be dealt with without resorting to violence. I think those are elements here in El Salvador that are very present. I don't think they're absent in the other countries, but it's very intense. The size of the country is small, and it's very populated, and the polarization is not based on class and race in the same way. I mean, obviously those elements are here, but this polarization that's based on what people understand to be my enemy or my ally, looks a lot more like gang warfare in a lot of elements. I mean, I think that influences the way in which people deal with conflict, because it's not necessarily value-based, but is based on fear and trauma of a group that has been othered with elements that are oftentimes for external people hard to understand. I think authoritarianism is a huge part of the reason why people accept violence as a viable form of social control, discipline, order. I don't think that's unique to El Salvador either, but I do think in recent political events, what we see is an increase of popular acceptance of authoritarianism and sort of a praise of this is the solution. And I think we'll see that in some of the other questions that we're going to address today, how that plays out.
Thank you, Jeanne. I think that you really summarized it very, very well. And it's a good way to think about it. And it is also very, very important to point out about this, the dense, how densely populated El Salvador is. I think that we also, that's a key feature of El Salvador that we definitely need to keep in mind. And one of the matters of concern that really pushed us to believe that this series was important and that discussing violence was important is the fact that usually violence is simplified to gang violence. That's how violence is understood. So this is why we thought that it was important to ask you to identify other actors of violence in each of the countries. And this time I would like to start with you, Alejandra. What do you think are the other actors of violence in Guatemala?
Yeah, violence is a multi-casual phenomena, and also is it's have like a lot of organizations or people like practicing violence, no? So adding to the gangs for sure, and I'm sure Jeanne can explain that more in the El Salvador, that I think is a bigger problem. It exists in Guatemala for sure, but I will add for sure another organizations of organized crimes, crime like narcotraffic, I'm sorry for my rusted English, narcotraffic. We are a bridge. Honduras and Guatemala are a bridge for the drugs to United States, and for sure violence stays in here. Also is the militarism. Again, explaining from the years of war and a logical of a powerful army that reinforce the violence. It's in the same way like a private security corps, especially in the areas of where mines and mega projects of extraction are working, and it's like a big conflict especially in rural areas that are practicing violence against defenders and indigenous people. I will repeat again the thing of the domestic violence. I think we have to repeat it again and again because it also happens. And yeah, and also it's organizations that work like pretending to be gangs and are not, and doing another exercises of extortion, for example, or car robbery, etc., etc. And I would like to clarify that in the last year, I'm not sure in Honduras, Danielle can explain that better, but in El Salvador and Guatemala, the data, the homicides are descending, especially the pandemic year, that it will take us another conversation, but the numbers are descending, and it's like another analysis that we have to make. But I think it's important also to mention this because it's important, no?
Thank you, Alejandra. Yes, I think it's an important element also because the pandemic has highlighted some issues and is also inviting us to question or try to explain others, I think. So, Jeanne, let's go to El Salvador by popular demand. Why don't you
Right.
describe to us what's happening in El Salvador?
Well, I won't describe it all because obviously I think Alejandra has covered a lot of things that are happening. And I think probably people are more aware of gang violence than they are of some of the other things. I want to emphasize two things that are often overlooked or justified by people, at least here. And that is the level of violence of the state against people via the military and the police. The pervasive abuse and police brutality is just overwhelming. Anytime you're in any community where there's gang presence, you expect to hear people talking about gang violence, but what they're talking about is police violence. And sort of the constant threat that the police can arrest you for anything. That came out in the recent political campaign where political violence was actually via this many reports of the police working on behalf of the party who swept the election, threatening people to arrest them for various things that seemed cooked up, from everything from that kind of violence to just, beating up kids because they look like gang members and extrajudicial killings. So that's the violence on the part of the police, the military, and security people within the prison system is of serious concern and is an actor that's often overlooked. And homophobic, transphobic, diversiphobic violence that's exercised by kind of a faceless crowd of people. It's not faceless when you hear the stories of people, what they lived through in their childhood, at school, at work, in the church. It's regular people, but there also seems to be some organized violence that targets LGBT people, especially trans people in particular. So I just wanted to bring that to the space as well, because I think it reflects that we're in this sort of context in which there's so many different kinds of violence and people are vulnerable. There's generalized violence, but there are definitely criminal actors involved, and there's complicity on the part of the state in many cases, but there's also direct violence from state agents.
Theyk you. I think that those are all very, very good points that you are making. Danielle, how would you complement these two very good answers and descriptions?
So hard. They just said it all so well. There's an interesting point in the comments from one of our wonderful members of the public here about the US role. And I actually would love to speak to that because, I opened by addressing economic violence as something that oftentimes turns into or spurs physical violence as well. And I think it's important to also draw out how US actors can be involved in that, and not only the US government, but also US private actors. And an example that I can offer is an investigation that I published in November of last year with my colleague, the Honduran journalist, Jennifer Avila, who's the director of Contracorriente. And we had some help from Maria Teresa Ronderos of CLIP and Gerardo Reyes at the Univision Investigative Unit. And all together, what we were able to reveal was that the largest steel company in the United States, Nucor, had spent at least 4 years in business with a Honduran company that's developing a very problematic iron oxide mine that dozens of locals have protested in an area called Guapinol. And those community members who have protested have been criminalized. They've been put on trial, they've been held in prisons, some for more than a year, on charges that there's little evidence to support that were brought by the Honduran company. That company is owned by a businessman named Leonid Perez, who is the son-in-law of the infamous Miguel Facuse, the palm oil baron. And Nucor, we found, went into business with Leonid Perez to develop this mine on land that is supposed to be a protected national park and a place where it would be therefore illegal to mine, but that was changed because the Congress modified the bounds of the park when this request for the mine came in. Nucor did this business using shell companies in Panama to connect with the Hondurans. It seems reasonable to believe that the presence of such a powerful US company could have empowered or influenced the criminalization of this community. And this all fits into an old pattern, what is by now we recognize an old pattern, in which the extractive industry sells itself as development. Inevitably, there is criminalization or harassment or violence exercised against those who protest, whether it's the environmental damage or the damage it would do to their communities. They know it doesn't offer them jobs. They know it won't lift them out of poverty. Ultimately, it oftentimes causes emigration. And so these cycles can continue, in part because of at the hands of actors that are private U.S. actors, along with the U.S. government, as our audience member pointed out.
Thank you, Danielle. Definitely, I think that it's important to consider, the impact of foreign elements. There are a couple of other elements that have been brought by the audience, and I would like to ask whether any of you wants to comment on that. One of them is they ask about, family breakdowns, indiscipline, and lawlessness as causes of violence. So they are asking whether you believe that these are important factors. Would any of you care to comment on in this regard? Go ahead, Jeanne.
Something to that. Well, I think that family breakdown and violence in the family itself is part of the cycle, right? I think we've been struggling for years with the idea that families are responsible to raise children who will not become criminals, with no support, with no elements, with no structure. Families that have been formed in contexts in which there's no education about educating without violence. When I referred to earlier, the authoritarianism, the idea that you hit your kid because he hit his sister is not foreign to everyone's experience here, and it's really hard to unlearn that. So I think there's a lot to be done when working with families, but I've been really hesitant to say that somehow the family's inability to also create environments that are free of violence is somehow a burden that needs to be carried by them, and that the state's responsibility is somehow much less. I think we're interconnected, and I think we need to learn from each other. But the idea of just teaching values and that will protect people from becoming involved in criminal groups, especially things like gangs, has been proven to be not the case at all. And so I really think that families need to be strengthened, but from a point of view that's much more based in human rights and learning how to live without resorting to violence to deal with conflict.
Yeah, and that's definitely a big cultural challenge. Alejandra, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I just will add the thing that is also a huge phenomena of the single mothers families, or the single mother homes, and it cross again with the economical violence. So it's women that are that have to work all day outside home and with long hours, and they have to leave their children alone. And sometimes or a lot of times the children are growing in the streets and are watching for another references, etc., etc. And I think also is another of the spots of these explanations.
Thank you, Alejandra. I think that it's very important. We go back to Danielle's initial comment about economic violence, like it trickles down and it impacts. But we also have definitely this, cultural constraints and this belief that it's like this happens in the family, but I think that Jeanne point about the lack of support is also crucial. We have a comment from Kathy who's talking about, and she's asking about sexual violence. She's particularly mentioning, women who become pregnant as a result of rape, and also the use of sexual violence by gangs. I don't know whether any of you would like to add anything in this specific regard.
I can just say something brief. I think it's important to emphasize that sexual violence permeates the culture and life on many, many levels in Central America and in Honduras as well. And gangs, I think, reflect that and sometimes maybe concentrate it, even more, using it as a weapon of power, but it's everywhere, and so I think I would just caution against seeing that as a particularly gang, which the question doesn't necessarily suggest at all, but it's a nice opportunity to bring home that point that it's not just gangs that use sexual violence as a means of power. And of course, we see that in the United States too. I don't mean to say that this is a unique problem to Central America.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, Danielle.
Now, can I just add just a little thing?
And I can see that Jeanne also wants to jump at it.
It's going to be
ahead,
so short,
of course.
But I think it's so important to point that what Danielle already said, that it's a cultural and a social thing, that it explained with mental health also, because it's like an heritage of sexual violence, for sure. And it's like data that says that 60-70% of women that suffers, women and boys, kids also, that suffers sexual violence, it's from the people that is in their family or is close to them. It's just not the gangs. It's like a thing of power. And I will remit to Jeanne saying about the patriarcado and the sexism, that it's like a power thing and oppression thing and another weapon to practice violence.
Jeanne, go ahead.
I think everyone said it. I just would also remind people how often sexual violence was used in the civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador, and how very little that has been addressed in general in terms of the reparations. Cristosal is part of the judicial process of the El Mozote massacre, and the issue of sexual violence is it's just so difficult to deal with, even in something that's as big as that. So you go from that extreme to the everyday kinds of sexual violences that so many kids are living with no one to address it, name it, or condemn it, or protect them. So and that's part of the trauma that sort of permeates the relations on so many levels. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. And this is perhaps a very good moment to remind the audience that the next Thursday, we are going to be specifically discussing gender. And of course, if we're going to be discussing gender, that's going to be, again, another time to discuss gender violence, which we're very glad that we are bringing into this discussion, because usually we very much have a problem when gender violence is viewed as a separate issue and it's discussed. So it's very good that we're able to bring it to the discussion today, but that discussion will continue next week. So we've tried to kind of structure these questions in terms of trying to depict a picture, as challenging as it is with the time constraints that we have. But now we have already seen questions, and of course, what we want to start discussing are approaches or solutions. Okay, we described the situation. And so what I would like to ask you is what you identify as major successes or failures in governmental approaches or societal approaches or solutions to violence. What do you think are kind of lessons learned from the past? And I would also like to ask you if you can include, and this takes me back to an element that was just mentioned, that Jeanne pointed out, which is the issue of impunity, the role of the administration of justice. So, what do we have to learn from the past in terms of, well, this was a good experiment, perhaps this strengthened with more resources, with more political will would work, or, lesson learned, let's not even think about trying this again. Danielle, you can start this round first.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I mean, I think that, in the US as well, we're going through a conversation and kind of a public reckoning about justice and policing and security, and what do those things look like? And I think it's an appropriate moment. It's like a fruitful moment, really, in the US and in Central America, to think about the failure of the systems that we've been relying on that are heavily policing and punitive justice focused. And it's kind of amazing looking at Honduras specifically, the extent to which the Juan Orlando Hernandez administration has been able to distract from pretty illegal activities that seem to have been happening, if what is being said from the Southern District of New York court is true, by promising to US authorities they would have a heavy hand on crime, and promising, the Hernandez administration was voted in twice to office, according to the reporting that came out after both elections, on a platform that largely promised a heavy, being tough on crime, right? That phrase that we have so much political experience with in the US as well. So at the end of the day, what we have is a strange reality in which, as police, Jeanne was saying this earlier, police brutality is ubiquitous, mass incarceration is unsustainable, and yet violence and crime remain really high, and the access to justice for average Central Americans and specifically average Hondurans is very low. And so talking about solutions is really important, but I think also finally listening to the voices of people who have been saying this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, is important. And we know those voices haven't been listened to because alternatives to punitive justice, alternatives to training the police more, reforming the justice system, et cetera, are rarely taken as serious in US foreign policy and in conversations around policy in general. So I think I can't drive home more how important it is to finally take seriously the voices of people who have been suffering because the same old, Juan Orlando was promising tough on crime while, what was the quote from the Southern District of New York? Something like finding out how to shove drugs up the noses of the gringos. It's such an effective, using gangs and using heavy-handed security policies, it's such an effective distraction from all of the other root problems or illicit activity in Juan Orlando's case, seemingly. We can get beyond that. We know that now. It's time to move past it.
Thank you, Danielle. I think that's really a very, very important point. And I think that it's also interesting, and I would like to ask Alejandra and Jeanne whether you can consider this in your answer. This, when we think about the peace agreements, as Alejandra mentioned at the beginning, as an important element and the promise of what they could bring, it's interesting to consider what was specifically done to reform police forces and the military. What new training was provided, what vetting was done, because individuals who committed mass atrocities remain in those armed forces. Not only there was no accountability, but they remain in those positions. And I think that it's an important element to bring to the discussion. Jeanne, why don't you go next in this round?
Okay, well, maybe I can give it just a different perspective and Alejandra can then balance it out with something. I think that there's been a lot of learning in the last decade or two from civil society and in greater or lesser degree with technical people within the governments about what actually are prevention measures, how do we address violence, what things need to be in policy and programs. El Salvador has had various positive experience on a more micro or small level of what works to try and shift the balance. It's not going to fix everything, but a comprehensive, integrating strategies that address various factors at the same time instead of focusing on just one part of the population. We know that that's more effective than trying to go in, just with criminal prosecution. We know that the table is balanced when we have good criminal justice that's based on human rights standards, access to justice, and due process of law, together with prevention, together with sort of socially focused prevention at 3 levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary, and prison systems that actually work to rehabilitate and reinsertion programs that allow people to reintegrate into society. We know that studies say that, and small micro experiences have shown us that it can work here too, in spite of a public discourse that no, these countries are too different from the rest of the world. Nothing that works anywhere else will ever work here. And obviously, I think things need to be adapted, but we know those elements. The previous government here created a policy called Plan de Salvador Seguro that was based on a process of dialogue, consensus from all the sectors of society who usually use the security narrative as a big debate, blaming the other side, right? But they consensed what the policy should be. It got written, people could nitpick parts of it, but it's basically what anyone who's ever worked on violence prevention reduction would say you need to do. So why doesn't it work? Why can't we scale up from the micro level to a broader level? And I think we've said here several times that we're talking about things that require shifts in cultural understanding of things, social relations, but we also have to de-incentivize violence. I mean, people make big money off of violence. So there's other elements that are at play there that need to be addressed as well. I think that there needs to be a way in which people work together to take these successful smaller things and say big funding, bilateral funding from the US government, for example, shouldn't happen unless it can show massification, unless it can show that this can be done at a bigger level and in a comprehensive way that addresses all the factors that we know need to be addressed, even if we can't do it all, but to do it to some degree that actually gets us to the next step or a next level. I think there's a lot to be a positive about. I mean, I've spent 30 years here talking about peace building and violence prevention. I think we know what we need to do. I think we need to learn a lot better how to empower people who have the voices that Danielle is talking about to get out there and say they are the experts. They're the ones who know the answer, and people need to start listening to what they're saying.
Thank you, Jeanne. Alejandra, how would you round up this round?
Just what you were asking about the peace agreements, for sure, the importance of the division in the civil forces and the armies, and essential. And it's supposed that it's already done, and the agreement it's already signed, but we still haven't. In Guatemala, and I think it happens also in El Salvador and Honduras, that it's army forces working in the civil area of security. So this is a big thing, because it changed the focus of how we see the violence. And already Jeanne explained it perfectly about the prevention and in a non-just punitive and punishing a system to prevent violence, no? And I will repeat again, remaining Danielle's first intervention about we have to close these big gaps between citizens and the opportunities that they have. We have to, we need education and health, etc., etc. For sure, somebody was asking in the audience about the indigenous people. For sure, we have to change this racist state and racist system that doesn't give opportunity to indigenous people, etc., because this is for sure the land of violence. And I will add the fight against the corruption. Guatemala had this big experience with CICIG, the commission that was fighting against corruption, because corruption just weakens the system and make that the justice system and all the rest of the state doesn't work to help to the citizens. We lost this corruption, this fight against the corruption, I would say, to simplify, but I think is one of the fights that the organizations and a lot of movements are still working, because the fight against the corruption means that you're gonna change the way that the power and the system is working. I don't know if it makes sense.
No, it does. It certainly does. So we have a last question, but I was wondering whether in that question you may consider some of the questions from the audience, because I think they are very much interrelated. So some of the factors that you have already identified are long-term projects, correct? And I think it's important to underscore that then there is the need for, long-term investments. And as Jeanne was also pointing out, it can't be like little experiments. There is the need for robust resources so that they can be widespread, sustained efforts. But so thinking, also, besides thinking about long-term efforts, let's think about the immediate need, what needs to be done. How can violence be addressed today? But I think the audience has another of interesting elements that they are bringing into the discussion. How to best support the needs of people so that they are not forced to migrate is a question that everyone is asking. What can be done now? Another element that was pointed out, and I think Danielle, this probably falls also on you, is thinking about short-term solutions and drug trafficking. And of course, on Honduras, when we think about drug, it's not that it's not taking place in other countries, but I think definitely Honduras must be considered in the answer. And I think, and I want to echo Julia Preston's from the Marshall Project question here about how can the aid be used effectively to address violence? If we were able to get on the eyes and ears of the US government thinking about the aid, what would work? And finally, Athena has been asking us about indigenous people. So she specifically is concerned about, what can be done. And these groups, definitely, indigenous people have suffered particular forms of violence. So in this context, what can be done? What would you recommend that are, kind of short elements on which the US government could invest, and solutions also that the countries can take by themselves? Because I think that the two elements should also not be separated, but there could be joint efforts, of course, so that these policies are successful. Alejandra, why don't you start this round?
Okay, I just gonna throw some ideas. Again, I think one of the important is to continue with the fight against corruption and the fight for the anti-impunity. I think is one of the biggest, but then little things like, for example, the permission for carrying guns. I don't know. Yeah, it's correct. Guatemala and our countries are just countries that are armed, that all the citizens have a easy way to get arms, and it's like a big commerce and black commerce related with guns. So I think it's important. Also, Jeanne already mentioned it about the rehabilitation and the sistema penitenciario.
Yeah, the penitentiary system.
Okay, thank you. And related with the USA support, I would say that it's also, it have to be pointed to the thing of anti-corruption and impunity, and enforce some unities in the justice system to permit to investigate and to support the victims, for sure. I could leave it in the and other, just one thing, but it's gonna be next week, the thing of education and empower a woman to develop also their economical independence. I think is very important.
Thank you, Alejandra. Jeanne, what would you add? Short-term, immediate solutions.
Well, I'm going to say that that's not really realistic, but I mean, there's not short-term solutions. There are steps to take towards solutions, right? So I think that, I mean, really absolutely immediately, we need a CCS, which is an international commission against corruption, to be international, to not be a CCS that's actually run by the government itself. We need an independent body looking at corruption and impunity. You know, there's a proposal to the National Assembly. If there's a commitment, we need to see it. In terms of rehabilitation in the prison system and the possibility of gangs being able to leave violent criminal activity, we need a law passed that will say that you're not just illegal for being a gang member, you actually can leave that and become a part of society that isn't automatically illegal. Those are internal things, but they really require that there's clarity from the part of the United States about asking for that and directing things so that there's a legal framework here to do the kinds of things that we need to do. I think the US is in a key position to be able to change immigration policy, but also to say, let's invest in creating durable solutions for people who are internally displaced or return to El Salvador in need of protection, because those solutions require an integral, comprehensive kind of program, and it can be done, and it can demonstrate that people can stay in this country. Not everybody who crosses the border does it because they want to go live somewhere else. So people want to be here, and we have to make this country livable. So those kinds of things that make it possible for somebody who maybe lives in a place where they've been threatened or they feel that they can't stay, can go and live in somewhere else. Because right now, internal relocation is very, very difficult. People try to do it on their own, they can't make it, so they leave. So we really do think that durable solutions are possible, and we think there needs to be a big investment in that in the short term while we're working on these other things, because it's part of a step-by-step process that's going to get us to a different situation. And maybe just finally to say that anything that's being done that isn't done with a human rights focus is probably bound to fail, because you can get short-term solutions by using authoritarian means, by manipulating things, by paying people to do things that look good. But if you don't have a human rights focus, it's not going to be sustainable, and it's going to contribute to the ongoing cycle of violence instead of contributing to a new way of doing things.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you for that very comprehensive and very powerful answer. Danielle.
Once again, they've said it all. That was wonderful. Thank you both. I find it hopeful that the Biden administration has signaled that they're interested in investing directly in civil society, and grassroots groups hopefully will be included as well, instead of through governments, given the significant causes for concern that we see. I also find it hopeful that they've signaled that the administration will be will take very seriously corruption, no matter who it comes from. And I do hope that that is borne out, because, as both of you just said, Jeanne and Alejandra, that's a significant issue. And I would like to I know I'm a broken record here, but I want to emphasize that I don't think people have been listened to in the way that they need to be listened to, communities and grassroots groups. And we are seeing the same problems cyclically come up. And I started talking about economic violence, and I'll loop back to it now. For me, journalistically, one of the moments that was most powerful in looking into the Berta Cáceres, the murder of Berta Cáceres, for seemingly connected to protesting and hydroelectric dam, was when I started to report out what we believe is the first hydroelectric dam in Honduras, which came about in the late 90s and early 2000s, called Babilonia, and it was in the rural department of Olancho. And it was all part of a regional international plan from development agencies and lending banks to string hydroelectric dams through Honduras, which was sold as, bringing electricity to the poor, generating it in a more environmentally friendly way, creating jobs. But in a story that we now know is familiar, the communities that would have been impacted by it, and ultimately were, protested, organized themselves. One of them was murdered in murky circumstances. And at one point, they set up this days-long protest camp outside of the Parliament building in Tegucigalpa. And I interviewed somebody who was there at that protest camp. And he talked about two moments in particular. One was a moment when the police just unleashed extraordinary violence against them to kick them off of the area. And then a second, which was this lovely moment, this memory that he had of, you know, the people were exhausted, they felt alone, they had been beaten down by the police. They felt like they were against this monster of this Babilonia Dam, and a group of buses pulled up, and it was full of Lenca, indigenous people from the entirely other side of the country. No connection, would not be impacted by Babilonia. There was no hydroelectric dam planned for that would impact the Lenca people yet, but they were led by Berta Cáceres. And those, you know, the guy that I spoke with, that I interviewed, talked about sitting with Berta on a curb and her saying in that moment that she knew this was bigger than that one dam. She knew things could get much worse, and that solidarity was needed. And from that time, there has been, again, a really articulate, forceful lobbying, political coalition building, speaking out on the part of communities, and yet that model has continued to be pushed. And so it's time to listen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danielle. I think that it's, you know, it's like this are really it's a lovely image that you leave us with. I don't know whether there are any, you had said you had images, actual pictures that you want us to show, and perhaps that's how, you know, I would love to stay all afternoon. I confess, talking to you, and the audience clearly has a number of issues, but we had scheduled this for an hour, so I would like to end the conversation with the pictures that you were going to show.
Sure, and I'll just preface that the photos are all but one are from the sorry, this is not a happy note to leave on, but the police crackdown of this protest. Again, years before Berta Cáceres became, you know, famous and then was murdered, and now we have much more understanding around hydroelectric dams and how that often leads to violence. But this is from the protest around what we believe is the first hydroelectric dam in Honduras, and it looks so similar to the sort of repression and crackdown that we see now. The other thing that I felt that really spoke to me about these images was the force of these people's no from the beginning, the clarity to be willing to put themselves in harm's way. The final photo is actually a photo that looks so similar to the others, but it's of a protest in which the police are repressing COPIN activists after Berta Cáceres' murder. Too cyclical.
I can't see them being projected. I can just see the file folder. I mean, they're really small.
Yeah, I wonder whether is there the possibility to show them? I guess there was some technical difficulty there. Oh, we're going to start again. Okay, yeah, sure.
Now you can see them.
The recent, yeah, that's the one from that was from by the way, a NACLA article in 2016. This image.
Well, I would like to thank you for your time, you know, for your generosity with sharing with us your views, your experience, and the work that the three of you do, which is very important to inform discussions about root causes. Understanding the complexity, the layers of violence, the causes of violence, and the impact of violence is a daunting task. Of course, an hour of conversation is limited. We could have gone in depth. We really thank the audience for all of your questions, you know, and comments, because we tried as best as we could to incorporate them all into the discussion today. I want to thank the three of you, Danielle, Alejandra, and Jeanne, for your time and your presence here today. It was indeed an honor to host this conversation with you today. And let's hope that the voices from Central America are listened to and considered when policies are being addressed and when the US is trying to define its foreign policy towards the region. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience, and we look forward to see you next week in our Root Causes series when we're going to be discussing gender violence, gender discrimination and gender-based violence. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.